This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I'm recording this on the 1st of March, and we are still in lockdown due to COVID. But things are looking up with the continued rollout of the vaccine. Today the weather's dry, but with cloudy skies. As it happens, a strong wind last night blew seaweed onto the promenade close to where I live, making my morning run along the seashore a wee bit slippy underfoot. There's lots of white horses on the River Clyde today, as the wind has not yet abated. In my last podcast, I took you from Dornoch to Wick, and that is our starting point today. We're going to continue our travels on the North Coast 500, a route that will take us along a 516-mile or 830-kilometre scenic route around the north of Scotland, starting and ending at Inverness Castle. As I mentioned before, I'm particularly excited in producing this podcast as I'll be returning to my family roots, that is Mackay country, and I'm delighted to be doing this for a number of fellow Mackays who have asked specifically for a podcast on this area. As we leave our guest house just south of Wick, we travel northeast on the A9, hugging the coast with the North Sea on our right-hand side. We'll be passing through Wick itself, plus the small settlement of Akergill and on to John O Groats, with castles, grand houses and sea stacks on the way. When we leave John O Groats, we'll call in to see the Castle of Mey, the late Queen Mother's home, before picnicking at Dunnett Head, the most northerly point in the British Isles. We'll pass through Thurso, see some fabulous sandy beaches for which the North Coast is famous, and go on to Bettyhill to see the Strathnaver Museum, with a room dedicated to the Mackay Clan. As always, it's great to share Scotland with you, and hopefully this will whet your appetite to come and visit this fine country for yourselves. To see some great photos of the trip and my videos of Scotland, please visit my website www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I always love to hear from you where you are and when you listen to the podcast, so please do drop me a line. And thank you to Dave Kerricker for listening in your sailboat, that's a first. Also, thank you to Larry Gavrick in the USA, and who hopes to come over and play one of my favourite golf courses soon, Crail Golf Course on the Fife Coast. Now, Larry's daughter is a huge Outlander fan, so she'll be pleased to hear what I have to say at the end of the podcast about my Outlander virtual tour. Jamie and Claire will be right here with me. Well, wherever you are, I would now like you to relax and be transported to Scotland on this third part of your Unique Scotland journey around the North Coast 500. I'm delighted to be taking you with me, and especially into Mackay country. Well, we take our leave of the idyllic Thrumster guest house, with our host bidding us a safe journey and the dogs making a fuss of us as we go. Out of the driveway and we turn left onto the A9 to get back to the town of Wick, about 12 miles away. Now, Wick is one of the larger towns on this coast north of Inverness, although having said that, its population is only about 7,000 to 8,000. In its day it was a royal borough and would have been an important trading port in medieval times. Locally, there's evidence of Iron Age activity from a hill fort at Garrywin near to the town. Evidence of activity around Wick from the Norse pagan period was discovered in 1837, when Viking brooches and bracelets were uncovered by archaeologists. Actually, the name Wick appears to be from a Norse word, V-I-K, Vik, meaning the bay, and it's also the word Viking. Now, I've mentioned in previous podcasts that a Norseman is simply a Viking who has decided to stop killing, raping and pillaging and to settle down and make a home for himself. I know it's a rather simplistic interpretation, but easy for me to get my head around anyway. Certainly, Wick was Viking territory in the 12th and 13th centuries, belonging to Norway, as did all of Caithness, until the reign of William the Lion of Scotland. Now, William the Lion should not be confused with William the Lionheart of England, who was known for his great successes during the Crusades. William of Scotland was not known as the Lion during his own lifetime, and the title did not relate to his tenacious character or his military prowess. Instead, it was attached to him because of his flag or standard, and that's a red lion rampant with a forked tail on a yellow background, and you'll have seen this if you've visited Scotland, because this went on to become the Royal Banner of Scotland, which is still used today. Just south of Wick, and on our right-hand side as we drive north, is the Castle of Old Wick, commonly known as the Old Man of Wick, or Old Man of Wick, and it's believed to have been the stronghold of Harold Madidson, Earl of Caithness and Orkney, a Viking name if ever I heard one. The castle dates from about 1160, and although you can't see it from the road, if you're interested, you just take a turn to the right before you get to Wick and follow a single-track road down to the sea. Well, leaping forward to the late 18th century, Wick became an important herring fishing port. The shoals of herring, normally plentiful on the west coast, moved away from that area to the east coast, and authorities turned towards Wick as a good prospect for the herring industry. Construction of Wick Harbour began in 1803 and was completed by 1811, and it soon became a bustling port with ships from the Western Isles of Scotland, Wales, Shetland and the Isle of Man. And with the rise in fisheries, the size of the town increased, and Wick replaced Thurso as the centre of both shipping and trade in Caithness. In 1800, a bridge was built at Wick, before which travellers from the south could only cross over into Wick via a wooden footbridge. 3 years later, the Highland Roads Act allowed a parliamentary road which ran from Inverness to Thurso to be built through Wick and then on to Thurso. In the early 1800s, many displaced Highland Scots poured into the coastal areas in search of work, and Wick was no exception, and a small town named Pulteney Town on the south side of the river was founded in 1808 to provide space for these new workers who had come to work in the booming fishing industry. Now, many of you may think Pulteney Town is a strange sounding name, but most of you whisky drinkers out there will have heard of it as Old Pulteney, and that's the distillery based in that part of town, and a nice little tipple it is too. Indeed, Pulteney takes its name from Sir William Pulteney, a governor of the British Fisheries Society, and he was responsible for commissioning Britain's leading civil engineer, Thomas Telford, who I've mentioned before, to design and supervise the creation of this new herring fishing town and harbour at the estuary of the River Wick. Coming forward again to the 1930s, Wick did not escape the vagaries of World War II, and in 1939 the local airfield was put under the authority of the Air Ministry and turned into an RAF base. The field was improved with hard runways, hangars and other buildings, and became one of 14 airfields ranging from Iceland to North Yorkshire, administered by No. 18 Group, RAF Coastal Command, and their headquarters was at Pitreavie, Fife. Now, I knew Pitreavie very well from my days serving at HMS Cochrane in the 1980s, in Rosyth, and often visited the site where the local admiral had his base. Rosyth is the first town you come to as you cross the Forth Bridge, heading north from Edinburgh. Well, in World War II, pilots flying from Wick engaged in reconnaissance, anti-submarine patrols, convoy escort, defensive Scapa flow, and strikes against the Germans in Norway and Norwegian waters. In May 1940, after the Germans defeated and occupied Norway, thus bringing German airfields closer to Scotland, Wick came under frequent air attack. It's stated that 222 high explosives were dropped on Caithness, and that Wick was attacked 6 times. The first and most serious bombing was on the 1st of July 1940, when a bomb fell on a street called Bank Row during daytime hours, when children were playing outside. The first daytime bombing in the UK. 15 people were killed, 10 of them children. 4 shops and 4 houses were completely destroyed in Bank Row, and in Rose Street several houses were damaged. A memorial garden nearby commemorates the loss. If you were to drive down Bank Road today, where it meets Rose Street, you can see where the old 19th century houses end and where new blocks have been built on the site of this war destruction, a sad reminder of man's inhumanity to man. Wick Heritage Museum is also in Bank Row and houses a commemorative plaque in memory of the 10 children who were killed. It's run by the Wick Society and focuses on the fishing boom era of Wick's history. The herring trade relied on the export of cured herring to the continent, in particular Stettin and St. Petersburg, but failed after the First World War. The star of the museum is the Johnson collection, which contains around 50,000 photographs, which was gathered by the local photographer's business between 1863 and 1975, and it provides a fascinating insight into the history of the town and the industry. And you should Google the Johnson Collection Wick Museum to see some of the images online. The modern town of Wick today straddles the River Wick and extends along both sides of Wick Bay. As we cross, if you look down to the left, you can see the famous Telford Harbour. The town used to be only on the north side, but Pulteney Town was officially merged into the borough in 1902. Wick also has a railway station and a small airport on the outside of the town. And the town also boasts a Carnegie Library, built from the trust funds donated by the great steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, another great Scot. There are also the local offices of the Highland Council. Indeed, as we enter the town, just south of the bridge over the River Wick, on the right-hand side is the sturdy sandstone building that houses the Carnegie Library. There's a lovely portico at the front with red granite columns either side of the entry. Many of the existing houses in this area date from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, sturdy, stone-built and ready to stand the ravages of vicious winters in this part of the world. I just have to mention Caithness glass, which is something you may have bought when you come to Scotland, or you will buy when you come to Scotland, and that used to be manufactured in this area. Effectively, it replaced the depleted fish industry. Sadly, Caithness glass is no longer made in the town, as the headquarters for the brand moved to Perth in 1995. As I said, Wick's not a large town, and we soon drive through and find ourselves heading north once more on the A99. After about 2 miles, you will see a tower house castle on the right-hand side. This is Achergill Tower, built around 1540 by the Keith clan. They had held the land since 1354 and were arch enemies of Clan Gun. There's quite a story behind this castle, and I've taken a particular interest in it since I discovered that my great-great-great-great-grandmother was married to the son of a Clan Gun chieftain. A legend relates the tale of a young woman by the name of Helen Gunn, who was abducted by John Keith for her beauty. Now that was not as uncommon in those days as it seems, and to escape her abductor's clutches, young Helen flung herself from the highest tower and fell to her death on the cobblestones below. Her ghostly figure still walks the castle today. This incident is said to have been the true beginnings for all feuding between the clans of the Gunns and the Keiths. It led to the Battle of Champions around 1450, which was a judicial combat which led to a massacre of the Gunns by the Keiths at the chapel of St. Tyr, just east of the village. As someone with gun blood, I was not impressed when I uncovered this in my research and immediately phoned a colleague of mine whose surname is Keith to berate him for this atrocity. Well, he assured me that he wasn't involved, and after 500 years, perhaps we should put it behind us. I agreed, and we're still friends. In the mid-19th century, alterations were made to the castle to make it habitable once more, but it was not until 1986 when the castle underwent a 2-year period of restoration work before opening as an exclusive hotel and business venture. As we continue north, we have the beautiful sands of Sinclair Bay in the distance on the right-hand side, and after another 10 minutes we can see another landmark castle, which is a baronial mansion built in 1755 to replace the old Keith's castle sitting on the cliff edge about a mile to the north. The new construct is called Keith's House, whereas Keith's Castle is a partially ruined stone-built ancient castle which stands on sheer cliffs overlooking Sinclair's Bay. Now this old castle was constructed as a Z-plan tower house with 4 floors plus an attic and a vaulted basement. Now you may be wondering what a Z-plan is. Well, effectively you take a square tower house castle, You add a pair of corner towers at opposite corners, and from above it looked like a Z. Now these corner towers give the defender the advantage of being able to see all walls of the castle and bring their weaponry to bear on any attacker. The present central square tower seems to be very narrow for its height, with tall chimney stacks above. And this old castle was built in the late 16th century by George Sinclair, 5th Earl of Caithness, but it fell into disuse and became a ruin by 1700. Keith's house, on the other hand, was built in its place to become the seat of the Sinclair family, and that was not uncommon, to either destroy the old Tower House castle and build a brand new house, or just leave it in the grounds as a sort of romantic ruin. Well, we continue north, and the road weaves its way between the North Sea on our right, only about a quarter of a mile away, and the flat grass fields full of sheep on our left. Within the fields are also numerous ruined buildings, and they're the remains of 17th and 18th century black houses that would have preceded the new bungalow type of house that exists today. As we pass Knibster, a small settlement about a mile north of Nice Castle, on the left-hand side you'll see a building with St. Clair's Hall on the side facing the road. This local village hall serves the local community, but it also serves as a memorial to those who lost their lives during the war. Outside the hall there are sandstone gateposts with monuments of a soldier, Donald Budge of South Keys, and a sailor, William Bremner of Keys. And these statues were moved slightly when the A9 was realigned, and a bottle containing coins from Russia, China, Germany and the USA were found in a recess under the soldier. Inside the hall is a marble plaque mounted on a purple painted frame. On top there are two lions, one on each side of the triangular top. Before the names there are two high-relief soldiers, one fighting and one that fell. And on the plaque are the names of 10 men from this area who went to war and never returned. It's a solemn memorial, and it's worth stopping for a moment's reflection before moving on. Further along the road is the Caithness Brock Centre, a rather unassuming stone-built building on the right-hand side of the road. There are more Brock sites in Caithness than anywhere else in Scotland, and this centre celebrates their existence. By rebuilding a Brock using the same techniques as the original builders, the Brock Centre provides an insight into how Iron Age people lived their lives in Caithness. From this point it's a straight run for another 5 miles to reach John O Groats, passing through the settlements of Freswick and Tofts. If you look right as we pass through Freswick, you'll see on the cliffs overlooking the North Sea what looks like a tall, large 5-storey house. This is in fact Freswick Castle and dates from the 17th century. The main occupants over the last few hundred years have been the Sinclairs, but it has fallen into disrepair but is presently undergoing considerable renovation work as of January 2021. As we continue on past Tofts, with only the occasional B&B on the roadside, we start to see the sea in the distance. This is the stretch of water called the Pentland Firth, and is known as one of the most dangerous stretches of water around the British coast. We can see Stroma Island just off the coast, and in the distance beyond we can make out the cliffs of the Orkney Islands. A wonderful sight. Eventually the road starts to drop down towards the sea, and we pass some log cabin pods on the left-hand side, great alternatives to the local B&B. And then, in a flash, we find ourselves in a large car park and the road goes no further. We've arrived at John O Groats. This point of land lies on Great Britain's northeastern tip and is popular with tourists as one end of the longest distances between two inhabited points on the British mainland, with Land's End in Cornwall lying 876 miles southwest. I actually know Cornwall quite well, having visited often when I served at the Royal Navy's officer training establishment, Britannia Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, and that was probably one of my favourite appointments in the Royal Navy. It was just super, taking young men from civilian life and turning them into Royal Naval officers. It's also a really beautiful part of the world, and of course I visited Land's End many times. However, now I'm at the other end of the longest distance between two inhabited points on the British mainland, so let me tell you a little about John O Groats. I'm sure the first thing you're wondering is why it's called John O Groats. Well, the settlement takes its name from a man called Jan de Groot, who was a 15th century Dutchman who once operated a ferry from the Scottish mainland to Orkney, the group of islands that you can see across the Pentland Firth to the north. Legend has it that O Groats refers to John's charge of 1 groat for use of his ferry. As it happens, the groat used to be a coin worth about 5 pence. However, it would appear that John was a rather tall man, and the de groot actually derives from the Dutch word de groot, meaning large. Well, the name John O Groats has a particular resonance because it's often used as a starting or ending point for cycles, walks and charitable events to and from Land's End. The phrase Land's End to John O Groats is frequently heard both as a literal journey and also as a metaphor for great all-encompassing distances, similar to the American phrase coast to coast. The population of John O Groats is small, with about 300 souls. The village has a small centre with a shop, pub and bar, and a hotel, all sitting not far from the water's edge, and overlooking the pier where the passenger boat runs from and to the Orkneys. The village is dispersed to the south, but the focal point for a visitor is the signpost showing the distance to Land's End and also other places in the world such as New York at 3,230 miles away, 280 miles from Edinburgh, 690 miles from London and 3,500 miles from the North Pole. And it's probably this signpost alone that accounts for the large number of tourists from all over the world that come here to have a photo call. Of course, John O Groats is not the most northerly point on the British mainland. That honour goes to nearby Dunnett Head, which we'll drive out to sea on our way along the North Coast 500. Well, we leave John O Groats and are now heading due west along the top of Scotland. To our left, flat green fields with numerous black-faced sheep grazing quietly in the cool breeze, and to our right, more green grassed fields with sheep, but this time sloping gently for about 500 yards down to the cliffs overlooking the Pentland Firth. About a mile offshore, we can also see the island of Stroma. It's a small island, about 1 mile by 2 miles long. It's an entirely grassed area of land with a slight rise or incline up to the centre of the island. Around the island, on the slopes, can be seen the abandoned stone cottages of former residents. The name Stroma comes from Old Norse Stromøy, meaning island in the stream, or tidal stream, and it's well named, sitting as it does in the Pentland Firth, which has one of the fastest tidal races in the world, with a top speed of 16 miles per hour being reported close off Pentland Skerries. When the tidal races are combined with gale force winds, they often give rise to extremely violent sea conditions, which have caused major marine accidents. In fact, in 2015, the cargo ship MV Semfjord sank, resulting in the death of 8 crew members. For a couple of days, the ghostly figure of the upturned hull of the ship could be seen in the water. Coming back to Stroma, ancient stone structures testify to the presence of Neolithic man, while a Norse presence is recorded around 900 to 1000 years ago. Present-day man has, since 1961, left the island to the natural wildlife and to sheep. When the lighthouse was automated in 1997, the lighthouse keepers were the last to leave. Stroma, now abandoned, retains its stone monuments from 4,000 years ago to the recent stone dwellings of the 20th century, and I just wonder if the 20th century dwellings will still be visible in another 4,000 years. We continue along the route to the west and pass through the small settlements of Huna and Kirkstyle before arriving at the small village of Gills. It's tiny, with a few houses scattered around, but there's a turning down to the shore and what is known as Gills Bay Terminal, one of the ferry terminals to the Orkney Islands. Gills Bay has one of the longest stretches of low-lying rock coast on the northern shores of Caithness. The harbour shelters some small local boats, together with those used for working the sheep on the off-lying island of Stroma, and in the right sea conditions the area's sometimes been used for surfing as well. While Scrabster to Stromness is the longest continuously used ferry route to Orkney, started in 1856, historically the Gills Bay area has been the main setting off point from the mainland to the islands of Stroma and Swona, and Orkney itself of course. And this route, known as the Short Sea Crossing, is generally considered to be both the quickest and safest across the waters of the Pentland Firth. At present, Pentland Ferries operates a year-round service on this route to St Margaret's Hope on South Ronaldsay, one of the islands of the Orkney group. I've done the crossing on a good day and it's only about 30 minutes, and you actually pass close to Stroma and you get a great view of the abandoned cottages on the hillside. St Margaret's Hope, with a population of about 600, is the third largest settlement on the Orkney Islands and gives access via causeways skirting around Scapa Flow to Kirkwall and Stromness, and also to the other main towns. Anyway, we're on the North Coast 500 route, and more on the Orkneys in a later podcast. A further couple of miles and we come to the settlement of Mey. This small village has become famous because of its castle, the Castle of Mey, which was bought by the late Queen Mother in 1952 and was one of her favourite places to holiday. We turn right at the signpost, Castle and Gardens of Mey, and drive for about 1 mile on a narrow single-track road until we arrive at a gatehouse to the castle. This entrance is closed, and we still can't see the castle due to a copse of trees dead ahead. We turn left and detour around a substantial wall that protects the castle grounds. Now, straight ahead, the sea starts to appear, and there's a castellated tower at the end of the wall, and then, after passing some very sweet cottages, we turn right into a car park, and the Castle of Mey is visible in all its glory. It's a large set of buildings with square crenellated towers that seem to be stuck together with smaller round towers at the corners of the buildings. It was actually constructed on a Z plan that I explained when talking about an earlier fortification, and the castle was built between 1566 and 1572. Seen from a distance, its turreted aspect is very striking. The jutting towers and corbelled turrets are typical of that period of the 16th century, particularly the checkered character of the corbelling of the smaller turrets. It's what a castle should look like, and, sitting only a few hundred yards from the water, what a view from the castle of the Pentland Firth and the Orkney Islands beyond. Superb. The original Castle of Mey, or as it was called in the 16th century, Girnigo Castle, was built by George, the 4th Earl of Caithness, and remained in the family for almost 400 years. It had a rather inauspicious start, as the first two sons, William and John, were murdered during a family feud, and it finally rested with George the youngest, whose descendants succeeded to the earldom. The name of the castle was changed to Bettyhill in 1789. But the major change to the building came in 1819, when the 12th Earl commissioned the famous Scottish architect William Byrne to make various ambitious alterations to the castle. A grand entrance and dining room were added, and I'm sure you'll have seen one of his commissions in Inverness. That's the new castle overlooking the River Ness in the centre of the town. Now, George, the 15th Earl, died at the age of 30. He'd never married, had no children, and he left the castle to his friend, F.G. Heathcote, who eventually sold it on to Captain F.B. Imbert Terry. Now, Captain Imbert Terry lived there rather frugally and was rather surprised when a distinguished lady, out of the blue, came to visit and to inquire as to the possibility of buying it. Unbeknownst to Captain Imbert Terry, this distinguished lady was no other than Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Just after the Queen Mother was widowed, she came to Caithness to stay with one of her closest friends, Lady Doris Viner, married to Commander Viner, Royal Navy. While walking along the coast one day, she came across this remote Barrowgill castle and fell in love with it immediately. At that stage it was little more than a wreck, with no electricity or mains water, and it was in a pretty ruinous state. Correspondence of the day reflects her thoughts at that time, and I'm going to read a letter to her treasurer or royal accountant, Sir Arthur Penn. When I was staying up in Caithness, I passed a dear little castle down by the sea, and when I visited, I discovered it was going to be sold for nothing, just the value of the lead on the roof. This seemed so sad that I thought I'd buy it, and escape there occasionally when life becomes hideous. The old man, who has lived there a long time, was very anxious to give it to me, but I resisted the kind gesture, and he has now offered it to me for £100. It might be rather fun to have a small house so far away. The air is lovely, and one looks at Orkney from the drawing room. The only sad thing is that part of the roof was blown off in the great gale last January, and I shall have to put electric light, of course. The grid runs past the door, luckily. Do you think me mad? Well, of course she did go on to buy the castle and change the name to the Castle of Mey. Well, the Queen Mother used to spend up to 2 weeks in August at the castle, returning for about 10 days in October each year. Since her passing, the Prince of Wales now visits the castle for a couple of days in August, and it's run as a private trust, the Prince's Trust. Sitting alongside the castle is a wonderful garden, protected by the 12-foot wall I described when we first arrived. I visited the castle a few times with guests, and I'm always tickled pink by the memories of Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. On arrival into the entrance hall, with a staircase leading up into the castle, there's a lovely portrait of the Queen Mother with her outdoor coat on, hat and Wellington boots, and these items are still hanging in this hallway, as if ready for Her Majesty to take her daily stroll. It's a super visit, and I do strongly recommend it, and it's a must if you are in or near Caithness. Well, we leave the Castle of Mey behind and turn right onto the A836 towards Dunnett. It's only 3 miles to this small settlement, and just before we get there, we pass St John's Loch on the right-hand side. This is an excellent spot, or one of many in the area, for brown trout fishing, and it's relatively easy to get a permit to fish from one of the local shops. As the loch is close to the sea, it's used by many species of coastal birds to nest in the protected area called St John's Pool, where artificial islands and mounds of sand have been created to give the ideal nesting location for terns and other birds. The pool area has been developed over several years and is protected from foxes and otters using a metal security fence. There's a couple of hides, so if you want to take a bit of downtime and just watch the local birds at play, then take time out and indulge yourself for an hour or two. Before we enter the main settlement, we turn right onto the B855 at a signpost saying Dunnett Head, 5 miles. Before we head out on the straight road to the promontory, there's a signpost showing Mary Ann's cottage just off the road to the left. This cottage, which was built in around 1850, has been preserved as it was lived in by Mary Ann Calder, who until she was 89 lived in the croft and cooked using peat over an open-range fire. The cottage has not changed much since the 1920s, 1930s. It's now owned by the Caithness Heritage Trust, who provide guided tours. The story of Mary Ann's life is beautifully told by the enthusiastic guides, and thanks to the cottage's original state and contents, it's possible to travel back in time, perhaps 200 years, and see how Highland folk lived. After our visit, we continue on and drive along a single-track road that winds its way across a loch-strewn heather moor and climbs gradually to a plateau with a large car park. We've arrived at Dunnett Head, the most northerly part of mainland Britain, and what a fabulous view. Straight ahead is the stubby Dunnett Head lighthouse, sitting on the edge of the 300-feet cliffs overlooking the Pentland Firth. There are some single-storey buildings surrounding the lighthouse, which would have been storehouses and workshops for the lighthouse when it was manned. The lighthouse was built in 1831 by renowned engineer Robert Stevenson, who was grandfather to Robert Louis Stevenson, the famous Scottish writer. The adjacent cottages, just up the hill some 500 yards away, were home to the keepers and their families until 1989, when the light was automated. Those same cottages are now in private hands, sold off to the public as holiday cottages. Across from the cottages on the hillside are the remains of World War II buildings. These minor fortifications were built during World War II to protect the naval base at Scapa Flow, and included a radar station which helped to give advance warning of the approach of enemy aircraft. The last time I visited in December 2020, it was a lovely sunny day, but there was a biting north wind coming in off the sea. Well wrapped up, I went for a walk along miles of uninhabited moorland and down along the cliffs with fabulous views across to the Orkney Isles. I had binoculars with me and was able to make out the Old Man of Hoy. It was also interesting to see a number of nesting birds taking shelter along the narrow ridges of the cliffs, which are home to thousands of nesting birds in season, including guillemots, razorbills and the much-loved puffin. The cliffs also give a superb vantage point for whale watching, and pods of orcas, porpoises and dolphins can also be spotted on migration around the north coast of Scotland. Well, after the bracing walk, it feels good to get back to the car, turn on the engine and start to feel my hands again from the warm air of the heater. This is the moment I cherish. Now refreshed after an hour's walk, sitting in the car, looking at the uninterrupted views of the sea, with the sun glistening off the windows of the lighthouse, with an egg mayo sandwich and a cup of warm coffee. Bliss. What more can you ask for in life? Well, for me, it's a coastal walk that takes in a fabulous beach, something that the North Coast 500 is famous for. And, having left Dunnett Head behind, we retrace our steps towards the settlement of Dunnett. Once we're back on the main road, we find ourselves at Dunnett Bay, a fantastic sweeping arc of white sandy beach backed by rolling sand dunes. It stretches for over 2 miles and is fairly sheltered from the elements, offering great opportunities to sunbathe, in the summer that is, from mid-July to mid-August, paddle, swim and indulge in other beach sports. It's also a surfer's haven and offers some quite dramatic surf when the winds are high. But for now, just kick off your shoes and socks, roll up your trousers and paddle in the clear, fresh, cool water, all along the sandy bay with a gentle breeze rustling your hair and the sounds of gulls flying overhead. Heavenly. Before leaving Dunnett behind, there's just one more place that is a must to visit, and that is the Dunnett Distillery, and calling to see the owners and brains behind the project, Claire and Martin Murray, and Mr. Mackintosh, the wee family dog. Back in August 2014, husband and wife team Martin and Claire Murray founded the Dunnett Bay Distillery to produce gin in this wonderful part of the world. They're obviously passionate about handcrafting spirits and using local hand-foraged botanicals alongside exotic botanicals from around the world. The distillery is not a large complex, and their stills, called Elizabeth and Margaret, produce batches of 500 litres. Their first and most famous brand was Rock Rose, named after the Rhodiola rosea, or rose in the rocks, used in their botanicals. They also use other unique botanicals, forged from the cliffs overlooking the Pentland Firth, which they believe provides a unique taste of the Highlands of Scotland. Of course, before COVID struck, their new visitor centre was a popular attraction for tourists along the North Coast 500, but numbers have reduced dramatically. However, the company have signed international export agreements, so happily it looks like this business is set to continue to grow. Well, we leave the distillery and continue west, and I have to say at this point that my guests, you, will have tasted the fine Rock Rose at the distillery. I, the driver, of course, will have abstained, but I may have a little tipple later from the bottle that I bought before I left. 5 miles later, and we arrive at the town of Thurso. As we pass the Welcome to Thurso sign on the left-hand side, we are driving past a housing estate called Mount Pleasant, consisting of 1930s-style houses, semi-detached, 2-storey dwellings, and as the road swings around to the left, on the right-hand side is an impressive castellated gateway, which is part of the 19th century castle built on the foreshore, and more of that later. We continue on until we arrive at a junction, with Wick and Inverness on the left-hand signpost, and Scrabster and Tongue on the right. We turn right. We drive about a mile and cross the River Thurso, a river which is 34 miles long and with a reputation for excellent salmon fishing. It flows through the town and into Thurso Bay and the Pentland Firth. The river estuary serves as a small harbour, which has a fine beach and looks out towards the Orkney island of Hoy and the towering Old Man of Hoy beyond. Thurso is the most northerly town on the British Mainland and is situated at the northern terminus of the A9 road, the main road linking Caithness with the south of Scotland. And Thurso has a population of about 8,000, and if you include the surrounding countryside it increases to about 10,000. The name Thurso is derived from the Norse Thorsa, based on the deity of Thor and translating as the place on Thor's river. Thurso's history stretches back to at least the era of Norse-Orcadian rule in Caithness, which ended conclusively in 1266 when protracted negotiations between the Scottish and Norwegian king resulted in the Treaty of Perth, whereby Norway recognised Scottish authority and sovereignty over the mainland and the Hebrides, and Scotland acknowledged Norse sovereignty over the northern isles of Orkney and Shetland. In Norse times it was an important port, and later traded with ports throughout northern Europe until the 19th century. It was a thriving fishing centre and had a reputation for its linen cloth and tanning activities, all of which, of course, have now gone. There was a considerable boost to the Thurso and Caithness economy and population by the creation of 2 nuclear establishments in the 1950s. They were the Nuclear Power Development Establishment, NPDE, for the development of civil fast breeder reactors, and the Vulcan Naval Reactor Test Establishment, NRTE, a military submarine reactor testing facility. Both of these no longer perform their original research functions, and decommissioning started some time ago. The NPDE will enter an interim care and surveillance state by 2036. Interestingly enough, an announcement in July 2020 that Nuclear Decommissioning Authority will be taking over direct management of the site from the Site Licence Company in 2021 has alleviated fears of 560 local jobs. Well, once we cross the bridge, we turn right down Riverside Road, and hidden away among some modern houses we can find the ruined Old St Peter's Church, or St Peter's Kirk, which is one of the oldest churches in Scotland, dating to at least 1125. It certainly served the parish for hundreds of years, and as you look at the ruin, it's possible to see some 17th century additions. It's now roofless, built of rubble, and with ashlar dressings. It's orientated east-west with irregular north and south aisles, forming a rough cruciform plan. And there's an impressive 17th century Gothic Y tracery window in the south gable. And inside you'll find roofed burial vaults and various 18th and 19th century mural monuments and 19th century tombs. Outside there's a burial ground surrounded by a rubble wall with a simple round-headed arched entrance from the street. Old St Peter's has no longer been in use since 1832, when a replacement church was built for the parish, and that church is St Andrew's and St Peter's, which is of Gothic style and was built to design by the famous Scottish architect William Byrne, who I talked about when we were at the Castle of Mey. Before we drive back to the centre of the town, if we head down to the waterfront, we get a good view across the River Thurso of Thurso Castle. Built in 1872, it's now a ruin. There has been some sort of fortress on that site since the 12th century, but any vestiges of the old fort are now gone. The present castle was partly demolished in 1952, but part of it is still habitable and remains the home of the Viscounts Thurso. While you are on the waterfront, it's worth taking a stroll along the promenade to see a beautifully painted gold and black statue which was erected in honour of a well-respected physician and expert in sanitation, Dr. John Grant Smith. He was so highly regarded that there was a public funeral and collection to pay for the statue. It's aptly named Memorial Drinking Fountain, reflecting the work Dr. Grant put into ensuring a clean water supply and sanitation in Thurso. If we now drive back into the town and pick up the main A9 road again, just opposite the St Peter's and St Andrew's Church is the Thurso War Memorial, which is an impressive bronze statue of Victory sheltering a child, and is dedicated to those who lost their lives in World War I. Well, we now leave Thurso and continue west. 2 miles later there's a fork in the road, and we take the right fork to pop down to see Scrabster Harbour, which operates the Northlink ferry MV Hamnavo, which connects the mainland with Stromness on Orkney. It's like any ferry port with jetties where the ferry awaits its cargo of cars and passengers and the regulatory lanes that you have to wait in to board. But even if you're not boarding a ferry, it's well worth coming down to Scrabster to visit a lovely restaurant called the Captain's Galley Seafood Restaurant, which is situated near the ferry terminal. This quaint little restaurant is the perfect place to taste the freshest of seafood. I've visited a couple of times and love the lemon sole or scallop scampi, followed by a delicious lemon posset, topped with fresh cream and all freshly made on the premises. I have to say, when I visited, the staff were incredibly friendly and came out to chat once we'd eaten. Well, we continue west on the A836, and when we come to a small settlement called Force, we turn right down a single-track road to get to a small ancient church, Crosskirk Church. Now, once you park the car, there's a walk which unfortunately can be wet and muddy. It's about half a mile over agricultural land that's used for grazing animals, so it's really muddy when it's been raining. However, the walk's worth it, and you will discover one of the oldest ecclesiastical buildings in Caithness, in an isolated spot overlooking the rugged north coast. St Mary's Chapel was probably built in the 1100s, though the religious significance of the site may date back much further. 2 long-kissed burials were found on its grounds during excavation, and a Pictish symbol stone is said to have been found nearby, possibly dating from the 2nd or 3rd century. St Mary's was a dependent chapel of the church at Ray, which we'll pass through shortly. It has a plain rectangular design, sharing a lot in common with contemporary Norse churches of Orkney. Well, we make our way back onto the road, and as we continue west, we have the sea on our right-hand side, with flat farmland either side of us, and we pass the isolated farmhouses along the road And it's really just like being out in the wilderness, with the road stretching for miles ahead of us, which I suppose is part of the fascination and enjoyment of doing the North Coast 500. But suddenly, coming up on the right-hand side, there's a rather incongruous set of buildings on the coast breaking up this wilderness landscape, and as we get nearer, it's clearly a rather large complex with a radar-type bulbous dome in the centre. Of course, it's Dounreay that I spoke about earlier, the nuclear test site. I have to say I remember from my Navy days that this was called HMS Vulcan, and if you got an appointment to HMS Vulcan, so far north in the British Mainland, it was assumed that you'd upset someone in high places. Of course, today I would consider such an appointment to this northern outpost one of sheer bliss to live amongst the beauty of this area. The dome is one of the most recognised features of Dounreay. In the 1950s, a sphere was considered to be the best shape of structure to contain gases from the reactor if there was a breach. It has been part of the landscape all this time, but there's now talk of it being dismantled in 2022. We'll see. Continuing on, we arrive at the settlement of Ray, from where the nuclear facility takes its name, Dounreay. And it's worth popping down to Sandside Bay for a stroll and a paddle if it's warm enough. This crescent-shaped expanse of sand is what makes the NC500 so famous. This is one of the smaller ones, and we'll be seeing longer, larger beaches, but just as deserted as we continue our drive west. Overlooking Sandside Bay is Ray Church, a lovely white harled T-plan church of 1738-1739, with a pyramid-roofed bell tower at the east end. It's worth having a look inside this traditional Church of Scotland building with a long central communion table and a hexagonal pulpit with sounding board. The nearby old churchyard contains several notable monuments, including the mausoleum of the Mackays of Big House of 1691. Big House is a further 5 miles west, looking over Melvick Bay and close to Port Skerra. And talking of Mackays, we're just entering the county of Sutherland, or what is known locally as Mackay country. This was, in days gone by, the area of the powerful clan Mackay, and an area that I'm personally very much associated with. My full name is John Robert Mackay Harbour, and I take the John Robert Mackay from my maternal grandfather, who was a proud Highlander, and whose roots originated in the glens and straths of this part of the world. And I can trace my ancestry back to the mid-1700s, and my family came originally from Strathnaver, that was cleared of Highlanders to make way for sheep in the late 1700s and early 1800s. We'll pass that strath when we arrive at Bettyhill. As I've mentioned in previous podcasts, the story of the Highland clearances are another story for another day. My family, once cleared from Strathnaver, took up residence at Skerry, a settlement further along this road, and we'll stop to have a look at it later in my next episode. It should not be confused with Port Skerra, which we find when we turn right at Melvick to drop down onto another fabulous beach at Melvick Bay. Melvick is another small village, but it does boast the Melvick Hotel, which is a good place to stop over on this NC500. If we drive on, we come to the turning for Port Skerra, an old crofting and fishing village, which is at the end of a road that loops round to come back on itself. At the turn in the loop is a small rocky bay with a concrete slipway to allow small fishing and pleasure boats to be launched and recovered. It's sheltered and suits the purpose perfectly. Port Skerra, like other fishing ports around Scotland in the 19th century, took advantage of a huge herring fishing boom. The herring fishing lasted until 1948, but the last Port Skerra fishing boat was not sold off until the 1970s. Port Skerra has always been a fishing community, and close to its pier, sadly, is the Drowning Memorial. This monument commemorates the many fishermen from the village who over the years have been lost at sea. The memorial stone includes a verse by the celebrated poet Hugh Mackintosh, who was born in Port Skerra in 1901. 3 separate disasters are remembered here. The dates are 5th of December 1848, 25th of June 1890 and 22nd of August 1918. The names of MacDonald, Sinclair, Fraser, MacLeod, Cameron and Matheson all feature. Leaving Port Skerra and Melvick behind, we continue west towards our resting place for this evening, Bettyhill. As we do, we pass the lovely sandy bays of Strathy Bay and Armadale Bay, and, once more, if you have time you can pop down to one of these secluded coves to while away some time in total isolation. About 1 mile outside Bettyhill, there's a turning to the small settlement of Farr, Cask and Swordley. And if you have time, it's worth travelling up the single-track road to see the small settlements and get a feel for how people lived in those isolated communities in years gone by. The road end takes you to a great viewing point looking over the cliffs at Farr Point, and if you subscribe to the Ordnance Survey Get Outside app, you will see some superb walks along this coast. We won't turn down to Farr Point, but as it happens, at this point in the road, it narrows to a single-track road and will continue like that for quite some distance. The NC500, Caithness and Sutherland coast is a mix of both narrow two-lane roads and single-track roads, and it can get pretty clogged up in the summer, especially with mobile homes. On the single-track roads, there are passing places where you've got to move over to allow oncoming traffic to proceed. But they are also to be used, and I stress this point, to allow traffic behind you to pass if you're just taking your time and meandering along the route. And most holiday makers want a slower pace, but don't forget, the locals use these roads and will need to move at a faster pace, so please let them pass. A couple of miles further on, and we start to pass cottages and a farmhouse at the right side of the road, and then a large cottage with a huge eye for information centre on the front of the building comes into view. In front of the building is a large car park, and we drive in. As we do, behind the building and to the left is an old church surrounded by a stone wall and a cemetery. The church is the former parish church of Columba, serving the parish of Bettyhill, but it's now closed. It's been taken over by the Strathnaver Museum and opened as a museum in 1976. Its main theme is the tragic story of the Highland clearances, but my specific interest is that it has a room dedicated to the clan Mackay, my clan, and also tells the story of crofting life. Sadly, there's not enough time to visit today, and that is the one thing we'll be doing in the morning. But for now, what we need to do is find some nice lodging and settle down for the night. Well, it's been a lovely trip on another part of the North Coast 500. Tomorrow we'll take up the story of Mackay country and look around the Strathnaver Museum. In looking to the future for the Mackay Museum, I contacted the curator Fiona Mackenzie, who graciously accepted my invitation to be interviewed. So I'm delighted to say we'll hear from Fiona on my next podcast. After that, we'll continue west towards Durness, passing through Tongue, where we find the old Mackay stronghold, Castle Wick. The walk up to the castle is well worth it, with fabulous views from the top. We'll take the causeway across the Kyle of Tongue and drive around Loch Errieball, used for centuries as a deep-water anchorage, safe from the often stormy seas of Cape Wrath and the Pentland Firth. It's named after the village of Errieball on its eastern shore. Durness is a small settlement on the northwestern tip of Scotland, where Smoo Cave will fascinate you with tales of bodies being thrown into the cavern below. And what's the connection with the Beatles' famous son, John Lennon? We'll also be hearing more about the North Coast's beautiful rugged coastline, with fabulous sandy beaches and spectacular views to the far north, with the Orkney Islands often visible on a clear day. Well, thank you once more for the comments from listeners and for your supportive emails. I know that there are a few of my previous guests who will recognise some of the sites that I talk about on our Mackay Clan tours, so welcome and enjoy another look at Mackay country. I'm delighted to let you know that I've started my live, interactive virtual tours by Zoom using Eventbrite Virtual Tours. My first one, a tour of the Trossachs, was enjoyed by a large number of people and ends this weekend. I have started my Outlander Locations tour, which includes photo, video and drone footage of some fabulous castles, palaces and extraordinary mansions associated with Outlander. It would be great to have you with me, so look out for them on my Facebook page, or there's a connection to virtual tours on the front page of my website. Normal times are 7 p.m. GMT, but if you'd like one at 7 p.m. Eastern Pacific time, for example, then let me know. Well, I do hope that you've enjoyed this week's podcast as much as I have enjoyed bringing it to you. Any comments are most welcome, and drop me a line using the contact page of my website, www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I always like to hear how and where you listen to the podcasts. Sadly, COVID persists, but the vaccination programme in the UK is well on track. And as I write this, our Prime Minister Boris Johnson has mentioned that he hopes things will start to return to normal in mid-June. Now that's great news, and I hope that if you are intending to travel to the UK, you have some certainty that your wait will not be that much longer. I can't wait to see you all back again. Well, my very best wishes to you, wherever you are in the world, and I raise my glass in the traditional Scottish fashion, Slanjava.
This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.